You never answered her question. You didn't have to. And yet she stayed, not because you loved her, but because you didn't flinch. Because when her voice trembled, your eyes didn't. When her beauty danced before you, your silence didn't chase it. There is a law older than language, buried beneath every flirtation and smile. A law that no one teaches, but every woman remembers. It isn't written in books, but in the pause before you speak, in the tension between her need to be seen and your refusal to be hypnotized. She waits for something she won't admit, not affection, not affirmation, but resistance. The resistance of a man not moved by hunger, not softened by the hope of reward. A man who listens not with his ears, but with his absence. You forgot when it started. You only know this when you stopped chasing. Everything began to follow. She never feared your cruelty, only your indifference to her performance. You walked into the room and said nothing, and it collapsed for her. Not the walls, not the chandeliers, but the stage she had prepared carefully, unconsciously, ritually. Every glance, every gesture, every tilt of the wrist meant to be a mirror for your hunger. But the mirror found no eyes. The script she rehearsed, soaked in perfume and breathless charm, unraveled, and you remained motionless, like a cliff watching the sea thrash beneath it. This was not cruelty. It was the absence of a wound to lick. No approval, no correction, only the silent storm of a man who does not need to be pleased. She tried again, louder this time. Her laugh stretched a little too far. Her eyes glimmered with practiced spontaneity. She became 1,000 women she had seen survive in rooms like this, smiling saints, clever foxes, wounded birds, goddesses wrapped in silk. But you didn't applaud. You didn't even blink. And for the first time, she realized you weren't the audience. You were the absence, the void that turned every performance into self-mockery. She felt naked, not because you looked at her body, but because you didn't offer shelter for her disguise. You were the man who didn't interrupt her delusion, and so she had to listen to it echo in her own skull. Others would say you were arrogant, emotionally unavailable, distant. They'd call your silence a flaw, but deep down, every woman who lingered in your orbit knew otherwise. You weren't the man who withheld affection. You were the man whose soul couldn't be bribed, and that terrified them more than any insult. You cannot tame what cannot be tempted. Because you did not ask for her story, she began to forget it. Because you did not chase her softness, it began to dissolve, and in its place, something older appeared. Not vulnerability, not pain, but a primordial instinct. A kind of surrender not based on words or reason, but on recognition. She saw in you a reflection of what she had spent her whole life trying to dominate, not a man, but a godless law. The law that says he who cannot be moved commands motion. She asked you what you did for a living. You didn't answer. She asked again. She smiled. She leaned forward. She pretended not to care about the answer. You watched her arms, not because they were bare, but because they were waving for attention, and still nothing. You didn't reward the question. You didn't punish it either. You simply let it vanish. And when it vanished, so did her script. She began to wonder what you were thinking. Then she realized you weren't thinking about her. You were simply there, present, but not reactive. She could feel your presence the way one feels the sun through a closed window, warm but inaccessible. She started to fidget, adjust her clothes, touch her hair. She needed a response, a sign, a cue, but your silence offered none. That was your power, not dominance, but detachment. You were not withholding, you were full, and she had nothing to offer that could tip the scales. This is what they never say aloud, that most women don't want to be worshipped. They want to be defeated, not violently, not cruelly, but spiritually. They want to see that their beauty cannot possess you, that their voice cannot direct you, that their tears cannot drown you. Only then do they feel safe enough to dissolve into something real. Only then does the act fall away, and in your silence, you became the arena for that collapse. She remembered the men who begged to know her, who rushed to decode her mystery before they even touched her skin. She remembered the way they clung to every glance as if it were a promise, the way they smiled too quickly, laughed too eagerly, leaned too far forward, hoping to prove themselves worthy of her performance. But those men vanished like perfume in the wind. You remained still, silent, terrible, because you weren't trying to understand her. You were watching the storm pass. There is a kind of man who listens to a woman's words and is seduced, another who listens to her body and is possessed. But the rarest of all, the one she remembers in dreams, is the man who listens to neither. The man who listens to the silence beneath her performance and does not try to fix it. That man becomes the altar, the myth, the cruelty she returns to in secret, and you were that myth. You weren't silent to manipulate. You weren't detached to seduce. You simply refused to be drafted into her theater, and in that refusal, she began to lose the script. She began to speak without knowing what she was saying. She laughed in places where there was no humor. She touched your arm not for affection, but to test if you were real. And you were unshakably real. That terrified her, because your silence said what no compliment ever could I see you. But I am not moved. You were not seduced by her power, and therefore she had no power. You did not flinch at her coldness, and so it melted. You did not bow to her approval, and so it became irrelevant. And in that sacred vacuum, she began to see herself not as the goddess she performed, but as the girl beneath the mask, the one who never felt truly chosen, the one who built temples of charm to hide her ache, the one who, deep down, always feared she would never be enough. You did not rescue her from that fear. You exposed it, and she obeyed not because you demanded it, but because she could not explain you. You weren't part of her story. You shattered it. And what remains when the story dies? Only the law, only the truth. And the truth is this: he who does not respond reigns in the temple of your silence. She finally knelt, not in submission to a man, but in surrender to reality. The performance had failed, the mirrors had cracked, and for the first time, she saw that her beauty was not a weapon, only a question you never answered. And that is why she followed. When you stop needing her to be beautiful, she starts to unravel for you. She stood in front of you like a question no longer certain it deserves to be asked. Her beauty, once weapon and wall, now floated around her like discarded silk, not enough to command the atmosphere, not sharp enough to pierce your silence. She noticed your gaze wasn't following her curves, but resting somewhere deeper, somewhere formless. She adjusted her blouse again, as if pulling the neckline slightly lower might rescue the ritual. But there was no magic left. You were not enchanted, not because you resisted, but because there was nothing to resist. You had no need, and nothing frightens the performer more than a crowd that does not need the show. This is when she began to fall apart, not loudly, not in protest, but in quiet collapses. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. Her stories drifted into abstraction. She forgot the names of the characters in her rehearsed tales. You watched her unravel the way one watches smoke rise from a candle just blown out slowly, invisibly, tragically beautiful. And she knew it, knew you were seeing not the woman she had polished into existence, but the strange creature beneath. The one who doesn't know how to seduce, who doesn't know what to say, who doesn't know how to win when winning is no longer defined by being desired. She asked why you didn't compliment her. You didn't. She asked what you thought of her dress. You said nothing, not because it was ugly, but because it didn't matter. You were not there to consume her. You were there to witness her come undone. The world had taught her how to conquer attention, how to use her laughter, her waistline, her mysterious eyes as a constellation of bait. But you didn't bite. You didn't even look away. You looked through, and for the first time, she became aware of the lie that beauty was power, and power could ensure love. You never chased her beauty. You starved it, not out of punishment, out of disinterest. And that made her desperate, not for your validation, but for your absence. She began to seek it like a confession, a punishment, a kind of spiritual whipping. Because if her body could no longer trap you, then maybe her soul could. But you didn't want that either. You were a mirror, but one without reflection. She peered in, hoping to see herself through your desire, but saw nothing. That was your cruelty, not rejection, but emptiness. You offered no echo. And so she began to speak just to hear herself. She asked questions she didn't care about, told stories she no longer believed, laughed at jokes you didn't tell. Her performance began to devour itself. That's when she began to change. First, she stopped talking. Then, she stopped smiling. Then, her posture softened. The mask peeled back one layer at a time. You didn't move. You didn't help. You didn't offer a shoulder. You remained still, as if you were the mountain and she had finally decided to stop shouting at it. She looked into your eyes and for the first time saw a place that could not be colonized, a soul that could not be charmed. You were free, and that terrified her, because freedom cannot be seduced. You were not a good man. You didn't perform empathy, nod at the right cues, or feign interest in her emotional dances. You didn't give her what she asked for. You gave her what was already there, nothing. And so she began to confront that nothing. She began to feel what it was like to exist without applause, without adoration, without the buzz of being seen. And for a moment, it broke her. Her beauty failed her. Her charm failed her. And in the failure, she began to shed the illusion that she was ever in control. This is when she leaned closer. Not to seduce, but to collapse. She began speaking in a lower voice. Her gestures stilled. Her eyes no longer darted for attention. They lingered in uncertainty. You hadn't won her. You had unmasked her. And now, she sat across from you like a ghost returning to the house where she died. This is the cruelty of a man who no longer needs beauty. He becomes the priest at a funeral she didn't know was happening. And the corpse. Her performance. Her persona. Her delicate manipulation of the world's hunger. You asked her nothing, and yet she confessed. You did not accuse her, and yet she defended. You did not leave, and yet she broke. All because you did not care to possess her. This is what makes a woman obey. Not dominance, not logic, not even love, but indifference to illusion. You didn't ask her to be authentic. You didn't scold her for pretending. You simply saw through it. And she, for the first time, felt naked in a way no man had ever caused, not sexually, but spiritually. Stripped of artifice, of control, of power. She sat in silence now, not as a game, not as a test, but because her voice no longer knew who it was speaking to. Not a man, not a target, but something older, something unmovable. You. The mirror that didn't lie because it didn't speak. And from that silence, something else began to emerge. A different woman, one not built on seduction, but on surrender. Not surrender to you, but to the death of her performance. She stopped trying to be beautiful. She stopped trying to be interesting. She became quiet, raw, She became someone who no longer needed to manipulate the space between you. And in that void, for the first time, she saw a door. A door that does not open with charm or laughter or lingerie. A door that only opens when there's nothing left to perform. You didn't open the door for her. You didn't even point at it. You were simply the room where it existed. And that's when she stepped forward. Not with grace, not with poise, but with confusion. Like a child entering a church she thought was abandoned. She asked you a question not for attention, but for real. You answered not to impress, but because the moment finally earned your words. And in that moment, her world reassembled around a new axis. Not the axis of control, but the axis of gravity. You were gravity. Not a prize, not a predator, not a protector, but the unshakable force that made everything else collapse inward. Her stories fell, her techniques fell, her certainty fell, and all that was left was her and you. Finally seeing her not because she performed, but because she stopped, nodded once, slowly, as if to acknowledge what had just died, and what had just been born. She kneels not for the man who loves, but for the one who cannot be seduced. You are not the man she imagined. You are not what her mother warned her about, nor what her friends prepared her to dissect. You are something much worse or much better. You are not a man at all, but a throne. Not the type that beckons, but the type that waits, cold, unlit, carved from something eternal. You are not warm to the touch, yet you are the fire she moves toward. Because power, true power, is not loud, not forceful, not in pursuit. It waits. It lets others burn themselves in its orbit. And she, like the others, begins to orbit. But she doesn't know why. She tells herself stories that you are mysterious, that you are wise, that you must have been hurt, but none of them stick, because you are not a riddle to be solved. You are the end of riddles. You are the final page in a book written in invisible ink. You do not ask to be read. You do not even ask to be known. And that is why she cannot leave, not because you promised her love, but because you promised her nothing. You do not listen to her in order to respond. You listen the way stone listens to wind patiently, without the need to shift. You absorb her, and yet you remain untouched. Not aloof, just complete. And she feels that. She feels, for the first time, that her identity cannot distort you. Her pleasure does not bend you. Her pain does not break you. You remain solid, watchful. And so she must ask herself, who am I if I cannot move him? This question eats her alive, because every man before you bent under her charm, bent under her tragedy, bent under the illusion of her uniqueness. They wrote poems. They fought dragons she invented. They died noble deaths for glances she rehearsed in mirrors. But you did not bend. You did not even sway. And so she does not know whether to love you or hate you, whether to worship you or destroy you. And in that uncertainty, she discovers something she never dared to admit. She needs to kneel, not in submission, but in awe, because she has seen everything crumble under her softness, except you. You did not resist her. You simply absorbed her like the ocean absorbs a single scream. You did not punish her. You let her punish herself with your silence. And now, she begins to see that your power is not in what you do, but in what you do not do. You do not explain. You do not chase. You do not perform. You do not reach. You do not flinch. And so you become the frame for her chaos, the edge of her abyss, the one thing she cannot define, and therefore cannot kill. She watches you speak to others. You are calm, clear, direct. No wasted words. You do not flirt. You do not flatter. You do not play games. She sees the way other women look at you, curious, then cautious, because they sense it too, that you are not hungry, that you are not waiting to be chosen, that you do not barter yourself for touch. You are already crowned, not by the world, but by your own indifference to it. This is why she obeys, not because you force her to, but because she wants to be near whatever doesn't need her. It is the most sacred thing she has ever touched, and it frightens her, because if you do not need her, then maybe she is not needed at all. And if she is not needed, then maybe, just maybe, she could be loved. Loved not for what she gives, but for what she is without giving. She tests you again, she pulls away, she becomes cold, she says cruel things masked in elegance, she disappears for hours, days, hoping you will shatter, that you will text, that you will chase, but you do not. And her heart breaks in a place deeper than she knew existed, not from your rejection, but from the realization that you will not abandon yourself to save her illusion. You are the man who refuses to fall, and because you refuse to fall, she rises. She stops pretending. She stops calculating. She stops speaking in double meanings. She becomes direct, vulnerable, harsh. She reveals the woman beneath the woman, the one who built temples out of manipulation, only to worship at the feet of the unshakable. You listen, not because you want to help, but because you want to see. You are not interested in healing her. You are interested in truth. And in that moment, when she dares to bring you her truth, you do not flinch. You do not look away. You meet it with the same silence you offered her charm. And that is when she breaks finally, fully, beautifully, because she understands now. The throne is not cruel. It is holy. It does not move for the wind. Not because it is cold, but because it is the place all storms return to. She thought you were a game to be won, a fortress to be scaled, a beast to be tamed. But now she sees you were never the prize. You were the ground, the sky, the silence beneath every song. And so she kneels, not because you asked, not because you earned it, but because the part of her that cannot be faked recognizes the part of you that cannot be moved. She does not confess her love. She confesses her hunger, her fear, her need to be conquered not by hands or words, but by something that does not need her to exist. You look at her, and you do not say, "I love you." You say nothing, because anything you say would be less than the silence that now binds you. You have dethroned every illusion she wore, and now she sits before you, not as a queen, not as a goddess, but as a woman. And you remain unchanged. You do not open your arms, you do not kiss her tears, you simply remain. And that remaining is the most violent act of love she has ever known. Because it is not love built on worship, it is love built on sovereignty. You are the unmoved king, the one who needs no validation, the one who listens without echo, the one who sees without claiming, the one whose silence has become scripture. And she, the priestess who thought herself divine, now understands that real divinity does not seduce. It witnesses, and in that witnessing, she finds peace. Not the peace of being adored, but the peace of being seen beyond her weapons, beyond her theater, beyond her beauty. And for once, she does not need to be beautiful, because she has found the one man who could never be fooled by it. And that is obedience. A chair sits in the corner of a room where no one speaks. Dust gathers on its arms. No one dares sit, no one dares move it. But sometimes, at night, she returns, just to look, just to remember the silence that would not break for her, the silence that knew her before she learned to perform. She does not knock, she does not call, she only stands at the threshold, and the throne, unmoved, waits for no one but remembers everything.